Welcome back to A Fine Time for Healing. I am your show host, Randi Fine. A Fine Time for Healing is a place where your physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being are all that matter. So put your feet up, relax, and enjoy the show. Today's special guest, TJ Woodward, is a revolutionary recovery expert, best-selling author, inspirational speaker, educator, and addiction treatment specialist who has helped countless people through his simple yet powerful teachings. TJ enlightens and entertains audiences around the world. Using his captivating and authentic style, he assists people in literally changing the way they exist through his informative and dynamic talks and trainings. He is also the creator of the Conscious Recovery Method. TJ is the author of the best-selling books Conscious Recovery, A Fresh Perspective on Addiction, Conscious Being, Awakening to Your True Nature, and Conscious Creation, 5 Steps to Embracing the Life of Your Dreams, as well as the co-author of workbooks that are accompanying it. Welcome, TJ.
Thank you so much, Randi. I'm delighted to be here with you.
I'm delighted to have you.
Thank you.
So, okay, we're going to talk today about toxic relationships. So I think the most important place to start is, what is a toxic relationship and how do you define that?
Well, I think for me, a toxic relationship is anything that is toxic to my soul or my spirit. And I know we're going to talk in depth about what that actually means. I think a lot of times when we hear people talking about toxic relationships, they tend to talk about the other person or the situation. And so I have kind of a deeper approach about how we heal from the inside out and then watch those relationships shift before our eyes. But the short version, if you think about a toxic waste dump, in the physical world, it's poison, right? And so if we're in any kind of relationships that feel poisonous to our soul, that would be considered a toxic relationship to me.
Poisonous to our soul. Okay, got it. So if we're in a toxic relationship, it doesn't always mean that the other person is toxic, or does it always mean that the other person is toxic?
Well, I think we could say yes and no, right?
Okay.
Because again, the tendency to look at the other person, and it's super popular now in our culture to label people as toxic, right? And it is true that we could be in a relationship with someone who is toxic, but that label, I think, actually disempowers us from doing the inside healing or the internal healing. Another way to say it is, if I believe I'm broken or damaged or unlovable, I am going to unconsciously choose people to confirm that core false belief. Sometimes when I talk about this, people say, well, it sounds like you're blaming or victim shaming. Not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we want to unplug from labeling the other person, the boss, the situation, the romantic partner, and look at how we came to choose this relationship, not from a place of blame, but from a place of empowerment, actually.
Okay, I like that. It
Thank you.
should come from a place of empowerment. And really, no matter the nature of this toxic relationship, and no matter how we got into this relationship, often there is something about us that was either drawn to it or kept us enmeshed in it.
Right.
And that's always going to be different. So you say toxicity starts within, and that we create our lives based on the perceptions that arise from the core false beliefs we hold about ourselves. We all kind of hold them until we're really aware. What do you consider core false beliefs? What are we doing that we're not aware of?
Well, let's start with the baseline understanding that we come into the world as whole and perfect spiritual beings. And if that doesn't work for you, that language, we could say we come in as a blank canvas, right? And we're very susceptible to the energies around us. And the reason I use the word energies is when we're really, really young, pre-5, our brains aren't developed enough. We don't even have the cognitive ability to understand I grew up, I know your work, so I will say I grew up with a parent who one could consider narcissistic. And because of that, I developed these core wounds about myself. So I came in whole and perfect, wide open, absorbing the energy around me. And because of the world, right? Not from a place of the world is bad or horrible, but from a place of this is what happened. And I decided at a very, very young age that I'm not lovable and I'm not worthy. Those were early beliefs that got concretized into my unconscious, and they actually become a vibration, right? So it's not just I have a thought, I believe I'm unlovable. If it were just a thought, we could learn how to change the mind. I decided this at such a young age. So I was literally walking around vibrating that with the I'm not lovable core false belief and energetically aligning with people who on the outside seemed like perfectly wonderful people. And the truth is they were, but couldn't be less available for me. So I would say, see, it is true. I am unlovable.
I like the way you said that. I really
Thank
do. Because you really are staying away from the blame game here.
you. Right.
Um, and you're talking about um, the vibration that you're putting out and the vibration that it's matching.
Yes.
So that takes away the blame from a person or something like that and makes it more about a vibration, which is good. It's good. I think that opens people up to understanding because the first thing I notice, one of the first things I notice when I'm working with people is they're so reluctant to blame.
Mm,
And what I try to explain is we're not blaming, we're trying to understand. Because if you don't understand what the experience was, you don't know how to heal from it. But this isn't about blaming anybody, it's about taking responsibility for your healing. So it's a different way of saying it, but I like the way that you said that.
thank you. Yeah, because it really is not about blame. And in my own journey and in many of the people I've worked with, I love what you said. Sometimes we don't want to blame, right? Because we're like, oh, it's not their fault. And then we might move into the next phase, which is, oh, it's totally their fault. It's totally my parents' fault. And then we might move into they did the best they could, but sometimes that's dismissive of the experience, right? And so there's this interesting nuance that when we shift from blame to accountability, we can look at the knowing that it's less about what happened and more about what we decided about what happened. That doesn't mean we're going to pretend it didn't happen, right? There's this interesting nuance because sometimes people say, oh, they did the best they could, so I'm going to say that it didn't really affect me. But the truth is it did, right? And so in my own journey, I remember saying, oh, I had the absolute perfect parents. And then about 2 years into therapy, they were the most horrible people and everything was their fault. But then something pretty remarkable happened. I shifted from blaming them and I went right into blaming myself. And that kept me even more stuck because then I was in this shame experience of, oh, it's not their fault, it's mine. And I realized at some point that's really not going to help us heal. It's more about looking at the tenderness that I can have for that little child self that decided these huge things with such limited information. And that's where the real healing can begin. We shift from blame to curiosity.
Good way to say it.
Thank you.
So really everything gets imprinted on us as children. We,
Mhm.
like you say, we're a blank canvas, we're a blank slate. Everything's imprinted on us and we carry that. At what point do we really begin to notice that we've had this pattern of being in toxic relationships or relating to people in a toxic way or so forth and so on? Where do you think that really becomes evident?
Well, for me, what I have seen is that we realize this through our patterning, right? Through our relationships. I remember thinking, I thought this relationship was going to be different, and it's exactly the same. And we hear that over and over and over again, right? And again, we don't want to say, oh no, there's something wrong with me. I keep choosing these people or these work situations. We want to say, wow, isn't it interesting that this pattern keeps repeating I wonder what's happening within me that's causing me to choose this. Again, not from blame, but from curiosity. Because if I've created that over and over again, there is a way for me to uncreate that and to unplug from the situations and to plug into what are those core false beliefs we've been carrying? What is that frequency? Where did these originate? And how do I actually go back and heal them? In some ways, we can actually change the past, and that can be provocative. And the reason I say this is we know eyewitnesses are some of the least accurate. And so I have a narrative or a story that I'm carrying around about myself. And I think absolutely, if I knew exactly what happened, I could be free of it. But the truth is, something happened. I created a story. I had an experience. I developed these core false beliefs. And then from there, the trajectory of my life was solidified in these core false beliefs. So when we go back and start to heal them, in some ways we can change the past. And again, we're not saying that what happened didn't happen. That's the last thing we ever want to say. But what we are saying is, oh, I can actually change my conclusion and in some ways change the past.
Okay. All right. And the conclusion that you're referring to is the conclusion that we've drawn about ourselves,
Exactly.
not about the events, but about ourselves.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So what kind of conclusions do people who grow up in these kind of environments tend to draw for themselves?
Well, let's look at it
You
from
name the one. I'm not lovable, but yeah.
yeah. Well, and let's look at it from sort of a brain development standpoint. When we're really young, we think very much in black and white, right? So mommy or daddy is happy, I must be a good child. Mommy or daddy are upset, there's something wrong with me. It's not logical. As an adult, we can say, oh, of course, it's not the child's fault. When we look at something even more severe like sexual trauma, we understand it's not the child's fault, but there's something about the young brain that thinks, oh, there's something that I did to cause this. We hear this when parents get divorced. Oh, there's something that I did. So the reason I start with that is to realize that, as I said, the brain isn't even developed. So let's say we have a narcissistic parent and it's all about them. We will end up thinking, I don't matter, even though as an adult, we can say, actually, it was mom or dad that had this issue. But we don't really talk ourselves out of it because we're so susceptible as little kids. And so a parent's behavior can cause us to create these core false beliefs or develop them. And, usually they start with I am or I am not. And the ones I see most often are I am not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I am unlovable, and I am unworthy. There are many other ones, but those four seem to show up in most of the people I know on some level.
Right. And so these beliefs that we have about ourselves, this is not something that we can logically or consciously just erase. We can't say, okay, so I can disprove that, therefore it's not, because it is so within our core. It's a construction. It's the structure of who we've built, right? So how do we go about changing those deep-seated messages?
Well, I love the way you're framing it because so many people say, just change the narrative, just change the thought. Or they say, change your behavior, change your thinking, right? Opposite action we hear in some of the modalities. And that can be really useful. Or we say, use affirmations. All of that can be useful. But what you're pointing to is really what's dear to my work and my heart. And that is, we really, it's all happening in the unconscious and it's all happening at a vibrational level. So we can't really just change our thinking, because that's why we're like, as much work as I've done in therapy, as much I've gone to the workshops, I've done the communication skills, but there's something that happens that I keep re-choosing or choosing this relationship over and over again. So for me, I go back to, I ask myself a question and I invite people to ask this question: where did this originate? Now, we might not say, oh, it was that one day in first grade that moment happened. But for many of us, we'll say, let's live in that question. Where did this originate? We look back and we think about a time maybe that we didn't have that. In my own journey, I remember pre-5, I remember being so open and so happy. And just felt so lucky to be alive. And so there's something about remembering that and then say, wow, what happened to that awareness? When did I first start believing this? In my own journey, it was about intergenerational trauma from both my parents' side around sex addiction, around issues with food issues, addiction of all sorts. It came to me energetically. And so getting back and having some tenderness, it's really about reparenting, ultimately, giving that part of ourselves that feels wounded the love and attention that many of us didn't get as children.
How big a part is that genetic transfer? I know
Well,
that we do carry energetically, it comes through the genes and everything like that. But often it's kind of hard to disseminate which is coming through the genes or which is genetic predisposition because of the way that you're raised and you're more susceptible to it. That all gets a little confusing. Is there a way to sort of take that apart and understand it?
yeah, I love this. And I'm going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. One, I would say if I were to answer that question 10 years ago, I would have said, well, we have these genetic issues that really we can't change. But what we do have control over or power over is the environment and what we grew up in. But we're living in different times now where we're realizing we actually can affect the brain. We can actually heal. Epigenetics is showing us that the trauma comes through many generations. The great news is, though, as we heal, we actually start to change the genetic code. Now, this is much above my ability intellectually,
Right.
but
I
what I
understand.
do know is science is saying that we create new neural pathways. Now, a lot of times people say that's through behavior. I actually think it's we actually can heal these deeper issues. And we're realizing now we change the way we relate to our DNA, and over time it changes. When we actually lean into that, this is absolutely unbelievable. So the age-old question of nature or nurture is now changing to saying, regardless of whether it's nature or nurture, because I imagine it's got to be both, right?
Right.
We can actually change both of those. And that is a really exciting proposition and something that I think is very exciting about the times we're living in.
So changing the way that we relate to our DNA, do we just say, "Hey DNA," you know, "Hey DNA, listen, we don't agree." No, no.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously there's obviously a much better way to do this. So, what is? And I'm familiar with what you're talking about: neuroplasticity, the way that we can change the neurons in our brain, the neural pathways in our brain, and absolutely, this really is at the heart of a lot of the work that I do because we just need to change our mindset. You change
Yeah.
your mindset and you change almost everything. But
Yeah.
that's not easy because
Yeah.
of cognitive dissonance, because you keep getting drawn back to what you're most familiar with.
That's
So,
right.
what do we
Yeah.
do? So, how do we change our DNA?
Well, I want to be clear. I'm not a doctor, nor am I a scientist. But
Right.
what I do know is that as we start to develop a different relationship with these core false beliefs and a different relationship with who we believe we are,
Mhm.
we actually start to create new patterns in our life. Now, the science of that is we're creating these new neural pathways, right? We have a new behavior over and over and over again. It literally creates a different groove in the brain, if you will, a different neural pathway. And this happens over time. But what I'm curious about is like, okay, yeah, but what you just said is, yeah, that's true. If I change my behavior, even change my thoughts, I'm going to change that over time. But how do we actually do that? And as we've already established, it's really much deeper. It's about going in and having tenderness and curiosity about the little child.
Mm.
I looked at my nephew when he turned 7 and I thought, oh my gosh, by his age, I mean, I look at him, obviously he's much older now, but when he was 7, I thought, gosh, he's just this perfect being. But I, at that age, decided I was not good enough and I was unworthy. And it kind of breaks my heart, but that can also break our heart open to a different possibility. So going back, really becoming aware of those core decisions I made, allowing my child to actually feel the impact of what was happening instead of going into the defense strategy, or what I call a brilliant strategy. And from there, we can have a different conclusion and really start to change the way our life looks, the way our life feels. And then over time, we're going to create new neural pathways, and we're going to have a very different way of being with ourselves in the world. And that becomes then the automatic way of living, not the old one.
And being with ourselves is really depends at some point on being with our child, our inner child.
Yeah.
And for anyone that believes that you leave your child behind, it's just not true. You are acting, you are functioning from the mind of that little child, aren't you, TJ?
Yeah. And, for some reason, the last week, I've met multiple people who have shared with me that their grandparents survived the Holocaust.
Mm.
And that it's kind of interesting. You know how sometimes it's like, wow, that I'm hearing this over and over again. Let me be really curious about that. One person I sat down and had a conversation with, he said, my grandparents survived the Holocaust and no one ever talked about it. But I knew it was there. And he was saying, I knew it was there. I could feel something. I could feel the trauma. Now, as a child, he didn't say, I can feel the intergenerational trauma, right? It's just, there was something about the grandparents that were very afraid. As an adult, he understood it intellectually, but he had to go back and say, what did that feel like to be in that energy of that trauma, and of people therefore coming out of that experience and having a whole set of strategies to survive that got passed down? Totally understandably, but as a little child, he was absorbing that, and that work needed to be much deeper than just healing it by saying, of course, that was their reality because they had experienced it. I think about people who went through the Depression. We could name all kinds of different experiences that would cause this generational trauma to be passed down.
Yes. People often ask me, why I think the cluster B disorders like narcissistic personality disorder are so prolific. And I can't really come up with anything except the one thing that I can think of is many of our fathers or grandfathers were in World War II. They fought in World War II. These men came home with PTSD, although it was called shell shock and things like that. And I can't help but believe that was passed on through their behavior and also through the genes. Like my father he was a medic on the front lines.
Wow.
So he saw the worst of the worst. But he talked about the World War II as if it was the best time of his life. He talked about it he's 99, he's still talking about it. Trying to process it and everything like that. But I really do believe that had an impact. And of course, anytime there's been a war and, soldiers have come home, that's going to influence their children. And one thing I tell people all the time, I'm like, if you have children, if you don't want to do this for you, please do it for your children, because there's no way you can compensate for this. Your children will inherit your mindset.
Yes. I remember when my nephew was young, I would say things and thought, oh my gosh, that was my mother's voice. And it was just automatic. And I had to go back and like correct that. I wanted to go back and correct that because I know how that felt as a kid. And so I agree with you 100% that we can become unconscious and pass these things down. And we think that's normal, right? Like we don't have any other way of relating to reality other than what we experienced growing up. I recently heard someone, and I thought this was so encouraging about where people are at in consciousness. A friend of ours is pregnant now, and her husband said, I need to go do some deep work in these next 9 months because I don't want to pass this down to our child. And I think that's so beautiful, right? Because he's aware but it's time to address it. And that's, you know, a lot of times when people have kids, all the childhood stuff comes up because we're right in it, right? And we can feel that same energy. And so I love what you're saying, because we can actually heal and not pass this along to the next generation.
That was my determination. I wanted to end the legacy
Yeah.
with my children. But initially, as conscious as I was of this, initially my anger was coming out, my short fuse was coming out and things like that. And when I realized that, I'm like, what am I doing?
Right.
And I got help right away because I was not going to do this to another little child.
Right.
So that's so important. And you also, I know that you also work with addiction. How does this all play into addiction?
Well, what I've discovered in 100% of the people I've worked with, that the three root causes, and when I say the three root causes, I don't mean the only causes, but these three I see in everyone I've ever worked with, these three root causes, and that's unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. And so when we look at what we've discussed, the trauma that gets passed down, the traumatic experience of living on planet Earth, we disconnect from our true nature. We start to believe that we're something other than this beautiful, whole, and perfect, infinite being. We start to believe we're broken. And then we develop toxic shame. And I call it toxic shame because shame is literally toxic to our system when we believe we're broken. And so core false beliefs that keep us feeling stuck really is another way to say shame. I believe I'm broken, and then I start to choose relationships like we've already talked about from this belief I'm broken. And how it relates to addiction is when these things are so prevalent in one's life, we have to find someone or something to bring relief. And if we, for example, let's say we find a drug that helps us find relief. Oh my gosh, finally, I found something to really not feel all of these things, not to feel this shame. And it's easy to become addicted to it because, wow, that felt really good. You know, in the beginning, it just feels like relief, or it feels really good. And then we can become repetitive about it. And again, you know, the brain science is we start to create this groove of like, cocaine is what I need, right? And then we become addicted to it.
It makes total sense. It's just one coping strategy. It's a
Right.
coping strategy. And it's just, unfortunately, when you choose that coping strategy, it just makes your life that much worse, you know? It's
Yeah.
not
Because,
like it's, yeah. So what were you going to say?
well, I mean, what once brought relief, you know, the paradox is it actually ends up the opposite ends up happening. Like even alcohol, right? Many people, maybe even most people, drink because it helps bring down the inhibitions. You know, we call it social lubricant for a reason, right? And so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But if one becomes addicted to it, the very thing that helped them to feel connected ultimately creates more disconnection. Once
Mm,
someone starts drinking so heavily, it's like they're not being social anymore in most cases. They're actually not getting the connection that it once brought them. So in some ways, there's some kind of line we cross where it's bringing us the exact opposite of what it did in the beginning. And that's where we would call it addiction, because we don't call it addiction as long as it's working. We call it fun. It's only when it starts causing problems that we say, oh, this isn't really serving me.
mhm. And hopefully, those who get into these addictions get to a point where they recognize that rather than just sinking further, because it can be it can spiral you downward to the point where you feel worse and worse and worse about yourself. And then, you don't even care anymore.
Right.
Um, so you work with people who have addictions?
Yeah, I mean, mostly my work now is training clinicians in the field of addiction treatment and mental health, because there's something that happens with many people who are addiction counselors or therapists. Many people have been trained to diagnose and treat, which of course is important. But I come in, I'm sort of the spiritual guy, right? So I come in and say, in addition to that, what would it be like to look for the part of the client you're working with as infinitely capable of their own healing? And of
Mhm.
course, the paradox is, you know, they can't do it alone because here they are in treatment, right? Something is not working for them. But this idea that our clients are broken and our job is to fix them first of all, it's exhausting. And secondly, it's not really effective. So I go in and I train clinicians through an experience of what it's like to actually hold space. And we hear this term a lot, but to help someone realize that they have the ability to actually heal. And we're here actually to see something about them that maybe they can't or haven't been able to access for themselves.
That's revolutionary.
I think it is revolutionary. I hope that it is because, when I started working in the addiction treatment field in 2008, it was very striking to me, as I said in clinical meetings, people were referred to as their diagnosis rather than the diagnosis is a strategy to manage something, right?
So
When
like,
someone
I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, that kind of
Right,
thing.
or even these like I'm borderline or I'm narcissistic, right? We're presenting as that, but as long as we're only looking, if we're actually looking at the person as that, then we're almost co-signing on that behavior and concretizing that behavior rather than saying, I wonder what they're managing. If someone has a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, they're deeply seeking to be seen and heard. But if we're only looking at them as their diagnosis, then we're only treating symptoms and behaviors instead of like getting down to the actual root causes.
Mhm. Right. And perhaps with borderline, that, that may be the case. With narcissistic personality disorder, the person has no ability to to experience who they are. They can't, because what they do in order to cope with life is they form a false self, and the false self's job is to never let the true self feel anything. So you can't
Right.
get through, you cannot cut through the false self, and they're never going to be introspective, and they're never going to go within to be able to find out what happened. They can't. Like years ago, my mother said to me, she was having a hard time, and I said to her, Mom, you really should consider therapy. Now, my mother is the narcissist in my life. I said, you really should consider therapy. She said, oh no, Randi, I'm terrified of what's in there.
Yeah.
And that's basically the truth in this
Yeah.
way. But, I can see it in other mental illnesses. I can see it in addictions, drug addictions, alcohol addictions, gambling addictions, things like that. And really, what they are just coping strategies that are just because they don't have um, coping strategies that are concrete. They just didn't learn them. They're using whatever they can come up with to try to feel good in the moment.
Yeah. And so we just want to be curious about all of that, right? Because I think the paradigm that has been established is some of these disorders are permanent. And as you've said, in many cases, that's true. A person will go through their entire life and not be able to look, right? And so the disorder that we label the disorder is a strategy, but as you've said, it doesn't mean the person's going to be able to access healing that, but it also might be, right? And I always want to be open to the possibility that someone actually can start to heal that. I agree with you completely that someone who is truly what we would call a narcissist doesn't have the ability to actually look beyond that. But I also want to hold the possibility that they can, right? Doesn't mean they will. But if I'm saying they can never heal from this, then I'm part of that continued the paradigm that they're never going to get through this. And again, it's not simple here. There are layers to this conversation, but for some people, maybe they can start to heal from that. From other people, they might not be able to heal from that. But I think when we decide there's no one that can ever heal from this, then maybe we're missing an opportunity. And I think someone, like sometimes we would hear someone who is a sex addict or someone who's a perpetrator, these people can never heal. So they end up getting put in this camp of like, these people can never heal. So we just need to keep everyone safe from them. And that may be true in many cases. But if we continue to do that, then we're not really going to stop the cycle. We're just going to keep passing it on. So I want to be really curious about that. I don't have answers, but boy, do I have a lot of questions.
Yeah. Well, I hear that. I hear you that you like to be curious about that, and that makes sense. I mean, that's a really great approach. We we want to get away from labeling ourselves and labeling people, because that's really what you're saying. Once we put a label, once we smack a label on us or them, then that's what they become, and they're nothing more than that.
Right.
So, so that really does. I see where you're coming from with
Yeah.
that.
And I think what maybe what you're speaking to too is I've seen so many people thinking, and this is true for me too, I can change them. Right. And they end up in these, and I can't even put it in the eye. I was in these relationships where I'm like, but I'm the one that can get through. Right. And that's where the relationship can become really toxic.
Mhm.
I was, my first mentor would call it the Statue of Liberty complex. Bring me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. I can heal you. And so that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this. I'm really speaking to the professionals in this case, where it's like we're in a paradigm of this is permanent and we don't know if it is, or we're in a paradigm where it's organic or biological. And as we've said, it probably is in some ways, but it also might be environmental, and we actually can start to heal it. So for the person watching or listening who says, oh, great, this my partner might be able to have a breakthrough. I think what we're speaking in very nuanced ways about this, not
Okay.
it's this or it's that, right?
Thank you. Thank you for that
Yes.
clarification, because yes, that's really what my intention was in bringing that up.
Yes,
Yes, I don't want
absolutely.
people to have false beliefs, because
Yeah,
this has to come from the person. It's not
that's right.
something you can do. And
Right.
it's not something that's just gonna ta-da happen. It's
Right.
not gonna happen. Some people think praying about it is gonna make it happen, manifesting is gonna make it happen, thinking positive is gonna make it happen. That's not what we're saying here.
Right.
What we're saying is that maybe a clinician can look at it differently, but that person may or may not get to that clinician. So
Right.
clear. Thank you for
Yes.
clearing that
Absolutely.
up. You
I
get it.
want to always be clear because it can be confusing sometimes. And, we all hear what we hear. And that's why I will often say, I'm not sure if you said this, but what I heard you say is, right, let's get some clarification.
That's great. That's great. So what is the first step that we take in changing? So, I often, one of the first things I do with my clients when I really realize that they're stuck in this loop of limiting beliefs is I always have them, between the time I see them that day and the time I see them the next time, start listening to what they're telling themselves.
Yeah.
Because I think that we walk around telling ourselves a lot of lies, and we feel lousy when we do it, and we don't even know we're doing it to ourselves. So
Right.
what is the first step for you in recognizing these limiting beliefs that are holding us back?
Well, I love the way you said it because a wise person once said there are three steps: awareness, awareness, and awareness. And so it could be an awareness of like, in what ways does this relationship, someone will come to therapy and it's like the relationship is falling apart. That's usually one of the reasons we come to therapy, right? So an awareness of that in what way is this relationship historical? Does it feel familiar to all the other ones? And then what you're saying is then let's also be aware of the narrative, because many of us are walking around not realizing. I mean, I was so brutal to myself, but I had no idea I was. I didn't even realize I was saying to myself as an adult in my 20s, oh, I'm just so stupid. Oh, I'll never amount to anything. Oh, I'm not good enough. And so I love what you're saying, because that can be the beginning. And then we can go into the deeper awarenesses, the
Mhm.
awareness of what it feels like, the awareness of where it originated, the awareness of what it will take for us to start changing that, not through our mind, as we've said, but through something much deeper. So that's the awareness, awareness, awareness.
Mhm. Absolutely. And if I ask the question, what are you telling yourself? I get like, what? I'm not telling myself anything. Well, what are you saying when you're starting to really feel bad? I'm not saying anything. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's just take a little time, and I want you to think about that.
Yeah.
But We do. We beat ourselves up. That's our natural tendency, is to beat ourselves up, to blame ourselves. And people who are like this, who get into these toxic relationships and who have these limiting beliefs, are ones who always want to take responsibility for their portion. Well, I must have some responsibility for my portion. And then they begin to just bang on themselves, beat themselves up to the point where they have to take some responsibility. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes responsibility doesn't need to be taken.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because what often presents is the opposite of the core false belief. So the way I talk about it is core false belief, brilliant strategy rather than coping mechanism, right? So if my core false belief, so for example, a lot of very successful CEO types or type A's, that gets celebrated, right? Addiction gets looked down upon. Oh, that's bad. There must be something about you that's broken or that seems off or wrong. But a CEO type that, works 70 hours a week gets applauded. So sometimes this strategy or the behavior is the opposite of the core false belief. And the reason I'm saying this is someone might first be aware of the strategy. You might have someone say, well, I don't know how I talk to myself is you got this, you can do it, crush it, dominate. And that might be a strategy to manage because I actually don't think I'm worthy.
Good point.
Yeah. And in my third book, Conscious Creation, I walk us through this conscious creation process that I've created with two characters. And one of them, her name is Sasha, and she's a lawyer. And growing up, she was the perfect child and got all straight A's. And something that seems small and insignificant, she came home with a B once and her parents didn't talk to her. And she developed from that something so simple, I'm unworthy. And then her entire life became about perfection, getting more degrees. And she was trying to make partner in the law firm. And she's a character that's kind of a combination of many people I know. And she didn't get partner and her whole world fell apart. And she didn't understand why, because first of all, she had always gotten everything she had ever tried to achieve. So if we were working with her, she might say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any core false beliefs.
Right.
I'm always good. I'm perfect. If there's anything that I would say, it's that I have to be perfect. But underneath that, through some deeper work, she realized that that was actually a strategy of the I'm not worthy core false belief that was buried very deeply in her unconscious.
Good example.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that we can only do that for so long. We can only compensate for so long.
Yeah.
At some point, we crash. At some point, that all falls apart, and we don't. And then we have no idea why, and that's even harder. But I agree with you that we can do the opposite.
Well, and a lot of times people will come to therapy, and I'm sure you've worked with people who say, my life is great. I have the house that I thought would make me happy. I have the husband I thought would make me happy. I've got my two kids. They're in great school. Everything is going well, but there's something that feels unsatisfied. And we would want to be curious if that's because there's something unhealed deep within and they have achieved everything they thought would bring them happiness. And by the way, I'm telling my own story. That's what happened to me in my 30s, right? I got the house, I got the partner, I had the Lexus, I had the business, everything was supposed, but I still don't feel deeply satisfied, right? And so the journey for me was realizing that a lot of that was a compensation for, and it was just a call to do deeper work. So a lot of times people their life falls apart, they get a divorce, they lose the job, they go through a bankruptcy, and that's an invitation to look. But for other people, it's just like, I don't know, there's got to be something more than just this. And when someone comes to therapy or to recovery and says, is this all there is? That can be an entry point as well.
I see what I call overachieving and underachieving as a result of growing up in a family with a narcissistic parent. And the overachiever is always trying to prove something. Like you said, compensate to, make sure they're good enough, to show the parent they're good enough, thinking if they do all this, they will then be more loved or approved of or whatever. And then you have the underachiever who is the one that no matter what they did, they never were good enough. And so they develop a defeatist attitude and then
Right.
they become underachievers, you know.
Yeah.
So, but these are very much related to what happens to us in childhood.
Yeah, and for some of us, we go back and forth between the two. Achieve, achieve, achieve. Our world falls apart. See? So we it's almost like it's this back and forth, almost in a bipolar way of like high achieving, oh failure, high achieving, failure, right? And I love that what you said, because in some way we're still trying to get our parents' love, even as an adult.
Mhm.
But we're also the deeper approach is, as a result of growing up with that parent, we did develop the core false belief. So we're not really consciously saying, oh, if I get another $1 million, my mom will finally love me.
Right.
But it's something that's, as you said, it develops so early that it becomes an unconscious strategy. Most of us, like someone who's highly anxious, for example, they don't wake up one day and say, oh, I hope today is the most anxious day ever. But they go into the day and anxiety is managing something. And in that same way, we're not consciously thinking, if I just get this promotion, my mom will finally love me. It's much deeper than that. And as we're trying to heal that, we keep trying to heal that, but we don't really heal it from the outside in. We heal it from the inside out.
How do you help people get in touch with that child, that inner child?
Well, I think it's an awareness that it's happening to start with, because, how many times you've heard someone say, oh, that's ridiculous. I've moved on from that. That didn't affect me. Someone's strategy. And this, it doesn't always show up in men only, but a lot of men do that because
Mhm.
it's like, oh, I'm not my past. I'm ready to move on from that. Right. Because many times, and I know gender norms are changing, gender in itself is changing,
Right.
but a lot of men are taught, just, man up. You don't have to have feelings. Just, they go into the intellect because that's what they've been taught. So for some people, even getting to the idea that it might be maybe possible sometimes every now and then that inner child is a wound that's running the show. So again, the awareness of that. And then for me, I go into a meditative process where we can think of a situation in our childhood that was painful and see if we can go back to that memory. Not like we have to go back and re-traumatize ourselves, but go back and see if we can remember what we decided about ourselves. And the three phrases I use for inner child work is, it's okay for you to feel this way, it's safe for you to feel, and I'm here for you.
Mm.
And as we start to have, because a lot of times inner child work, people will say they almost want to talk their child out of feeling the pain, but we want to actually create safety internally
Mhm.
to allow our inner child to feel it. That's the key. I think the key is, we couldn't feel it at the time for a variety of reasons, and now the way we heal it is to actually feel it. Hey, that rhymed. Look at that. I'm sure I'm not the first person to ever say that.
No, but that's good. That's good. And are you familiar with Ho'oponopono, the Hawaiian?
Yes,
Yes. Okay.
absolutely. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. I love you. I'm sorry. And another way to approach it is, I'm sorry that I abandoned you. Nobody was there for you. Look, you're in this scenario and nobody's there advocating for you. Now let's be there and let me advocate for you. And it really does help. And the people that I've worked with that grasp this concept, they just grow by leaps and bounds.
That's right.
And then they never leave that child behind. They take that child everywhere, no matter what kind of professional they are. It's just truly amazing.
Yeah, because that's the reason that third phrase is, I'm here for you. And sometimes the child is like, oh no, you're not.
Mhm.
Right. And we look at the archetype of the teenager with this, which is sort of FU or rebellious.
Mhm.
And sometimes that shows up as addiction, but that's really that teen self, if you will, that archetype is trying to protect the child, but it really isn't protecting the child, because the child, as we've established, needs to be seen and heard, allowed to feel. And as you said, the most important thing in my experience too is I'm here for you, because we end up abandoning ourselves at a very early age. And that, of course, was a survival strategy, but it's no longer really moving us in the direction we want.
Right, exactly. You know, some people would call this psychobabble, but it is not psychobabble. It is so logical and it does work. And if, you know, I like the way that you're explaining it, you're taking it apart so that people can really see that this isn't just a let's do inner child work, you know, this is a cool thing to do. No, it's very important that we get in touch with that. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the other ways that that we can begin to change this narrative, this false narrative?
I think as we've established, the key is this inner child work, and we get there, so I love the way our conversation is where it's taken us, because we're first aware of the patterns, and then we're aware of the narrative that's created the patterns. And then we go deeper and we're aware of what's in the unconscious, the core false beliefs. And then the deeper healing work is, oh, there's this child that I've actually abandoned. And now I'm going to integrate. I'm going to start caring for them. So that really is, to me, that's the process. And that might look different for different people, but ultimately what we've said is the deeper work. I don't think there's anything deeper than saying, I'm going to learn how to care for that child. The only thing I'll add, and I guess sort of, in closing, or the final, it's like what I will add is there is a place within each of us that is unharmed and unharmable, and that we can actually heal the wounds and return to that. If it's true, we came into the world. And so I like to say there's a place within each of us that is whole and perfect. And that really all of this work is about reconnecting with, or being aware that that's there. So as we heal through this inner child process, we start to find that inner preciousness that's always been there, but for many of us, we abandoned.
Right. Great way to end this. And I know that you have to go because you have something going on, but I want to, for anybody that wants to get in touch with you, purchase your books. The one that I have here is Conscious Recovery. It's pale, but there we go, Conscious Recovery. And I know you have two in the background where you're sitting. So how do we get in touch with you?
TJWoodward.com. That's where you'll find everything, books, social, all my videos, and TJWoodward.com.
Great conversation, TJ. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate our time together.
Me too. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.